The soap god seriously needs to cut Cain some slack. First he gets tangled up in the Emmerdale car crash. Then he takes a shotgun blast to the chest courtesy of crazed killer John Sugden, Oliver Farnworth. Next thing we know, he's rushed to hospital, where the doctors discover a worrying mass growing that turns out to be the early stages of prostate cancer. To cap it all, his wife Moira is facing charges for people trafficking and murder, thanks to being framed from beyond the grave by her ruthless ex-business partner, the late Celia Daniels, J. Griffiths. Now Moira is in prison for the murder of Celia, who was actually killed by her own son Ray Walters, Joe Absalom, and Anya, a forced laborer on Butler's farm, who Celia had buried in Moira's blanket. The police put 2 and 2 together to make 5, just as evil Celia had intended. With the one person he can confide in behind bars, Cain has been feeling lost and struggling to come to terms with his diagnosis. He's desperate to exonerate Moira, but the police are having a hard time believing, understandably, that she had nothing to do with a modern slavery operation running right under her nose. Unfortunately, with Ray and Celia dead, there's nobody who can clear her name. Or at least, there wasn't, until Bear Wolf turned up alive. The formidable ex-wrestler and Dale's legend had been reduced to a shadow of his former self after months of being groomed and coerced into a life of forced labor by Ray, the man he thought was his friend. Emmerdale viewers mourned the loss of Bear when Celia bragged to Ray that she murdered him, which was seemingly confirmed when Ray discovered an unresponsive Bear upstairs at Butler's. However, reports of Bear's death were greatly exaggerated when during a horrifying showdown where Ray was about to silence Dylan Pender's, Fred Kettle. For good, Bear made a shock return from the grave, turned against his captor, and killed Ray to protect Dylan and Paddy. While his son Paddy Kirk, Dominic Brunt, was overjoyed to see his dad alive and kicking, he was left with a dilemma on his hands, and a murder to cover up. Can Paddy keep his recuperating dad as far from Houghton police station as physically possible? Not if Cain's got anything to say about it. As far as the deadliest dingle is concerned, Bear is the only witness to the atrocities that took place on Butler's farm, and therefore his best chance at clearing Moira's name. Only recently overcoming his Stockholm syndrome, Bear is emotionally traumatized by the nightmarish ordeal that Celia and Ray put him through. He's in no state to do anything. Besides, how can Bear exonerate Moira without incriminating himself? Cain Dingle had always believed that if you kept your head down, took your punches, and refused to ask for mercy, life would eventually get bored of trying to kill you. Lately, life had been proving him spectacularly wrong. He lay on his back in a hospital bed that smelled faintly of antiseptic and despair, staring at a ceiling tile with a crack shaped like the Yorkshire coast. The shotgun wound to his chest throbbed in dull, angry pulses, as if reminding him that it could have finished the job if it wanted to. Beneath that pain, quieter but far more terrifying, lurked the words the consultant had used with careful professionalism. Early-stage prostate cancer. Early stage, they'd said, as though that softened the blow. As though putting early in front of it made it any less cancer. Cain had faced prison sentences, beatings, betrayal, and death threats with a crooked grin and a raised eyebrow. This was different. This was something happening inside him, something he couldn't punch, threaten, or outsmart. And Moira wasn't there. That was the part that hurt the most. Moira Dingle was sitting on a hard plastic chair in Houghton prison, staring at a wall that had been painted a cheerful shade of magnolia sometime in the 90s and hadn't known joy since. Murderer. People trafficker. That was how the paperwork described her now. She clenched her fists in her lap, nails biting into skin. She had replayed every moment of the last year in her head, again and again, trying to spot the second where everything went wrong. Where Celia Daniels had woven her web so tightly that even now, from beyond the grave, she was still pulling the strings. Celia had been ruthless, charming, and utterly convinced of her own superiority. Moira had trusted her once. That mistake was now costing her everything. Celia dead. Ray Walters dead. Anya buried on Butler's farm, wrapped in Moira's blanket like some grotesque signature. The police had looked at Moira the way people looked at storms on the horizon. Inevitable, dangerous, and best dealt with quickly. You had the motive. You had the opportunity. You had a modern slavery operation happening right under your nose. Moira had learned the hard way that truth didn't matter nearly as much as narrative. And the narrative said she was guilty. Cain was discharged sooner than he should have been. He hated hospitals. Hated the way people spoke to him slowly, carefully, like he might shatter if they used the wrong word. Hated the pity in their eyes when they thought he wasn't looking. He wanted out. He wanted to do something. Because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking led him straight back to Moira, alone in a cell, facing life for a crime she hadn't committed. He drove home with one hand on the wheel, and the other resting unconsciously over his chest, feeling the faint tug of stitches beneath his shirt. Every mile was a reminder that time was running out. For Moira, for him, for everything. When he pulled into the yard at Butler's farm, the place looked deceptively peaceful. The same fields, the same buildings, the same sky that had witnessed unspeakable cruelty without ever flinching. Cain got out of the car slowly, wincing despite himself. "Right," he muttered. "Let's get this sorted." Paddy Kirk hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ray Walters lying dead on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, and Bear standing over the body, shaking like a frightened child trapped in a grown man's frame. Bear Wolf. His dad. Alive. That should have been the miracle. The thing that fixed everything. Instead, it had opened up a whole new nightmare. Bear was sitting at the kitchen table now, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't touched. His broad shoulders were hunched, his eyes distant. The man who had once filled rooms with laughter and confidence now flinched at sudden noises and avoided mirrors. Paddy hovered uselessly by the sink. "You all right, Dad?" Bear nodded too quickly. "Aye. Fine." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There was a knock at the door. Paddy froze. Another knock. Louder. "Paddy," Cain's voice called. "Open up." Paddy swore under his breath. Cain took one look at Bear and understood everything. The haunted eyes. The tension coiled beneath the skin. The way Bear kept glancing at the windows, as if expecting someone to come crashing through. Cain had seen that look before. He'd worn it himself. "All right, Bear," Cain said gently, which was not a word most people associated with him. Bear managed a weak smile. "Cain." Paddy crossed his arms. "He's not ready for this." Cain turned to him slowly. "Moira's rotting in a cell for something she didn't do." "I know," Paddy snapped. "I know. But you can't just. He's the only one who can tell the truth." Bear's hands began to shake. Cain noticed. He softened his tone further. "No one's forcing you, mate. But if Moira goes down for this, there's no coming back." "And Ray?" Bear's voice cracked. "Ray's dead because of me." Paddy stepped forward. "Because you saved us." Cain met Bear's gaze. "And because Celia and Ray turned you into a prisoner. None of that's on you." Bear laughed bitterly. "Tell that to the police." Moira was called to the visiting room unexpectedly. She assumed it was Cain. Instead, she saw Bear Wolf sitting at the far table, flanked by Paddy and Cain. For the first time in weeks, hope punched the air from her lungs. Bear stood awkwardly when he saw her, eyes shining. "Moira." She reached out, gripping his hands through the barrier. "You're alive." "Aye." Cain watched the reunion with a tight knot in his chest. This was what he was fighting for. Bear took a shaky breath. "I need to tell you something. All of it." Bear's statement took hours. He told them about Ray's manipulation, about Celia's cruelty, about the forced labor, the threats, the isolation, about Anya, about how Celia had killed her calmly, efficiently, and wrapped her in Moira's blanket like it was some sick joke. The officers listened, skeptical at first, then increasingly uneasy. "And Moira?" one asked. "She knew nothing?" Bear shook his head. "Nothing. She was being set up from the start." Cain sat rigid, barely breathing. This was it. The breakthrough came faster than anyone expected. Celia's financial records. A hidden account. Emails scheduled to send after her death. A confession. By the time Moira walked free, the sun was setting over the village, painting everything gold. Cain was waiting. She ran straight into his arms. For a moment, the world stopped trying to hurt them. Later, alone at home, Cain finally told her about the cancer. Moira listened, tears streaming down her face, hands gripping his shirt. "We'll fight it," she said fiercely. Together. Cain rested his forehead against hers. "Aye." Outside, the farm was quiet. Inside, life, bruised, battered, but stubborn, went on. And somewhere, Cain Dingle dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, the soap gods had finally decided to give him a break.